G'day, welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Dr Will Davies. Will has spent 37 years working as an independent producer of mainly historical documentaries and series for the ABC and SBS. He retired in 2010, and then Will started to write books, with the first published in 2012. And to date, he has had 10 published books. Today we are going to talk to him about his book, The Forgotten, Chinese Labour Corps and the Chinese Anzacs in the Great War. Hi Will, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Adam.
No, Will, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on and just talk about a forgotten chapter of history in Australia's war history. So we're talking about the forgotten, the Chinese Labour Corps and the Chinese Anzacs of the Great War. So the role of the soldiers of Chinese heritage in Australia's military history has largely been ignored, as your latest book title points out. What interests you about researching and writing about their contribution during the Great War, and what goals did you have for wanting to tell their story?
First of all, I knew nothing about it, and when I know nothing about it, and I'm pricked by something, I've got to find out more. So I knew nothing except about Billy Singh, and I was naturally interested. And as I said, But it was something that also triggered an interest in me because I was keen to involve Australians of Chinese heritage in our Anzac tradition. It all began really for me when I was wandering around Dernancourt Cemetery on the Somme, and I noticed some graves of the Chinese Labour Corps way up in the back corner, away from the lines of Allied soldiers' graves, and I wondered who these men were, and it stated they were the Chinese Labour Corps. Their names were there in both English and in Chinese characters, and it sort of, again, twigged my, this untold history. Really, what was it all about? So I began researching and trying to understand this difficult and what became a quite humiliating history. I'll tell you about it before, but it was one of those funny things that, a couple of minutes of inquiry led to me writing this book. And my hope, as I stated, was to contribute something to Chinese history from an Australian point of view. And having written the book, I got a nice comment from one ex-diplomat who stated that this was soft diplomacy in these times of contention between Australia and China. But it's important, I just wanted to remember the Chinese men. They're these mere coolies, they're virtual slaves who've been forgotten in history and time, and they're what I call the forgotten.
When World War I broke out, why was China faced with a hard choice, and how did it respond?
Well, to understand that, you've got to go back really 100 years. China was opened up with very small trading concessions with ports and through the introduction of missionaries, Christian missionaries. And then in the 1850s, you had a situation grew where Britain wanted tea and it had nothing to trade with China. So it introduced opium, and it used to purchase this opium in India and trade it in China. And this created a terrible opium situation. It led to the Opium Wars when an English ship with 1,200 tons of 20,000 cases of opium was impounded. The British brought in their warships and they won the Opium War and they conceded Hong Kong. But this triggered an internal war which became the Taiping Rebellion, and millions of people were killed. After this, there was continual defeats and treaties with various European nations coming in and setting up small trading concessions along the Chinese coast. And China, as one person stated, was cut up like a melon. And so here also we had the clash of the old and the new, traditional Confucian ways versus modern society. And this led, we probably heard of the Boxer Rebellion, the film 55 Days of Peking, but China just refused to accept Western ways. I mean, they tried to introduce the idea of trains and railroads, which were blossoming everywhere. The Chinese just didn't see trains as important at all. Compared to nearby Japan, which was opened up after Commander Perry went in on and basically forced the Japanese to put aside a 200-year-old policy of isolation. He forced the opening of American ports, but Japan responded in the other way. They accepted Western technology, culture, weapons. So by the time that the First World War was declared, China had a hatred pretty much for the colonial powers, and it was forced to decide which side will we go on. Will we go with the Germans because they had a small port at Tinsao, or do we go with the British? And now they hated the British the most, and the French. So they were in a bit of a pickle, and so they decided to stay neutral but to provide the Allies with manpower via a system of contracted labour. They really wanted a seat at the peace table. They knew when it came, and they figured that the Allies would probably win the war. The Germans, as I said, had a port at Tinsao, and that's where the Emden, the famous Emden that was sunk by HMAS Sydney, was stationed. And so the Chinese offered labour. First of all, to both the British and the French, but it was initially ignored. But after the disaster of the Somme in 1916, the British and French armies needed to release more men for the front. So they went back to China and they came to an agreement that these Chinese labourers would be sent to the front. They were not to fight. They were not to be involved in anything aggressive. They were just simply there to load ships, dig trenches, and be indentured labour. So that's how they found themselves at war, but not actually fighting.
Could you tell us about the Chinese Labour Corps' history and what its significance was for British and the French?
Well, the first discussions between the Allies and China was in about 1915, but as I said before, these failed. And there was a problem of the hiring agreement. They had to, the Chinese government did not want to be seen as providing men, so it became a case of, arm's length contractors rather than the Chinese government. A French delegation arrived in China in January 1916 and set to work. There were quickly 3 conditions put by the Chinese on the use of Chinese labourers on the Western Front. The first was that the men were not to be used in combat, that they received the same rights and conditions as British or French workers, and thirdly, China reserved the right to send observers to ensure these men's rights were respected. This delegation quite quickly came to the attention of the German Admiral Heinz, who was in China, and he protested. But the Chinese response was simply that these men were free to work, free to go to Europe. They were under contract, nothing to do with the Chinese government, and they worked for the French and the British. The British had also dismissed earlier Chinese approaches, much like the French. But again, as I said, with manpower shortages after 1916, they needed to look for labour further afield. They had Egyptians, they had Pakistanis, they had even men from Pacific Islands as contractors and labourers, and certainly from Jamaica, their colonies. These were simply labourers. But the Chinese quickly seemed like an ideal worker. They were resilient, they were cheap, they were tough and able to endure the northern winter, unlike the tropical labourers that had come from the tropics, and winter was uncomfortable for them. So by August 1916, Britain established a recruiting centre on the Shandong Peninsula at Weiwei. There was great secrecy in this, particularly from Germany and Japan, and it became difficult then to move them out of China. And the way they found this best worked, strangely, was to ship them across the Pacific. They landed at Vancouver at night. They were taken in high secrecy, put on a train. The windows were blacked out, and they went right across China from Vancouver to the eastern side of Canada, and were dispatched from ports again secretly for their voyage across the Atlantic, and then landing in Boulogne or somewhere on the French coast, and then set to work. So they had different sorts of work behind the lines. As I said, they were loading ships, loading trains, unloading, digging trenches, carrying, moving, was logistic work. They had some casualties, but we believe in the end about 100,000 went to Britain, about 40 to 50,000 went to France, and some say up to 200 to 500,000 went to Russia. but we don't know about that. And then they were returned after the war. So apart from a small group of about 8,000 that remained in Paris in France and became the basis of the Chinese community in Europe, really, they were returned home, again, a reverse of the same journey, across the Atlantic, onto the train, across Canada, onto the ship and back to China.
So, Will, why do you think men of Chinese heritage enlisted in the AIF, given the social difficulties experienced by them due to racist policies like White Australia policy?
It is interesting, and it is a terrible history. I mean, the first Chinese to land was in about 1818, and he went to work for the Blaxlands, and he subsequently ran a pub in Parramatta, and from then probably there were very few Chinese. But interestingly, MacArthur and his mates looked to import Chinese labour. As the convict system was wound down, they looked to replace these with Chinese labourers, but there was strong opposition to non-Anglo people coming into Australia. So by the First World War, there'd been a terrible history. We'd known of the gold rushes, the Lambing Flat riots, the open, violent racism that existed against Chinese Australians. So by the First World War, we're now, in some cases, 3 or 4 generations from their ancestors. They didn't look Chinese, they didn't sound Chinese, they often had English names, and they didn't even identify as Chinese. So hence we saw them, or they saw themselves as normal Australians, and so enlisted.
While it's known that many men of British heritage enlisted in the AIF hoping that they might be able to return to Britain to visit relatives or perhaps remain, what benefit was there for Chinese men to fight abroad on European battlefields?
Well, certainly not a return trip to China, and they probably weren't that interested anyway. But as I said above, there were the usual triggers. There was a sense of identity. There was a sense of joining up with your mates. They felt a nationalism, even though they had experienced, and their families had experienced, that terrible racism. But they probably joined for those very same reasons. They were also encouraged by the Chinese press, which was terrific. The Chinese were very active in contributing to war bonds, the Red Cross and the Comfort Funds. They were keen to be involved in Australian society, and as such, they encouraged their men to be part of that enlistment.
Well, in Chapter 13 of your book, you discuss the Defence Act of 1909. What did this mean for non-Europeans, and were the men of Chinese heritage treated differently to other non-Europeans, and how were men of mixed Aboriginal and Chinese heritage treated by recruiting officers?
Well, the first thing is that there was conditions on recruitment that men had to be obviously of Anglo descent, and, quote, not of substantially or they must be of substantially of European origin descent, and only British subjects could be recruited. So if they weren't considered British subjects, and at times they were outside of that designation, they could not join for that reason. Forget the fact that they might have looked different or they might have been Chinese. It was that they were not of substantially European origin or descent. Now, also, Chinese men were faced with the physical requirements of the recruiters. Many Chinese were slim, they were short, they did not conform to chest sizes. So, Chinese or not, they fell through the gaps in recruiting, simply that many of them were less than 5'2". So you can imagine that was a handy reason not to recruit them. Of, I think, about 240 Chinese Australians who enlisted, 62 had Anglo-sounding names and 179 of them, part of whose name was Chinese. Often they might be Peter John Wong, or they had a Chinese surname, but they had English Christian names or first names. Many of them too were, by this time, showed little evidence of being Chinese. and they probably got through, given that they met the physical requirements. Sometimes recruiting officers knew them and knew that they were good men and let them in. Other times, perhaps, they knew them as Chinese and refused to let them in. Of course, men of all types went, if they didn't get recruited in one recruiting station, they went to the next one and tried again. So a couple of the wonderful Chinese stories I've heard, they went from Townsville down to Brisbane, where they were not known. They were known in Townsville as Chinese, but they weren't in Brisbane. So they got in by moving themselves. The interesting case of Billy Singh, he had an English mother and a Chinese father, but he was known as a kangaroo shooter. He was a deadly shot. He was he was a good man to have around. So he would have had no problem, given that the recruiting officer probably knew him and knew his background. As for Aborigines, there was probably no difference in treatment than Aborigines or even darker Europeans. I mean, there was a group of Maltese that arrived in Australia, a whole shipload of men who came to Australia specifically to join the AIF, but they were dark Maltese and they were sent away. They were said, no, you're too dark. And they were Maltese, and Malta was part of the British Empire, so they were looking to, contribute, but they were told to go away, and they sailed off into the Pacific. I don't know what happened to them, but I don't think there would have been much difference between the Chinese and the Aboriginals. There's that great line in a private personal file of a Aboriginal trying to be recruited, and quote was, "Too dark for the light horse," which sort of says it all, So I guess their features, their physical size and their, those sort of conditions. I don't know that it would have been just abject racism saying he's Chinese, so go away. They needed men, and probably towards the end of the war a lot more would have been recruited than perhaps earlier in the war.
That's an amazing story, Will, that last question that I asked. And while fighting on the Western Front, what conditions did the Labor Corps experience in comparison to the Allied troops, and how were the corpsmen regarded by other soldiers?
Well, first of all, conditions were harsh and uncomfortable for everyone. Germans, Allies, everyone. The Chinese Labour Corps, they were contracted for 3 years by the British and 5 years by the French. They were paid 1 franc per day, and their families received, I think, 10 Chinese shillings per month. So their families were supported, which is very good. They were given a food ration of 100 grams of rice a day and vegetables, and they were also provided cooking utensils, bedding. They were issued 2 sets of blue cotton suits, woolen trousers, cardigan, waistcoat, raincoat, and a felt hat, plus a very distinctive metal waist disc that they put on their wrist with their name and their number, and this was quite a distinguishing feature about them. However, there was no provision for a pension or disability compensation, even for the sick and the wounded. So unlike British soldiers that left the war and they were looked after following their return to their home countries, the Chinese were forgotten. And they were probably regarded with some disdain, but life for everyone, as I said, was very hard, cold, dangerous, so perhaps they looked on these poor coolies with some respect. And there was a sense of they are contributing, they are helping, we must look after them. Their officers, the biggest thing they suffered from really was the inability of officers and those commanding them to speak Chinese. So trying to give directions to do jobs and work, precise directions, was often difficult.
So, Will, they were basically faced with the same conditions that all troops faced.
Yeah.
Do we know exactly how many men of Chinese heritage enlisted in the Corps or the AIF, and what kind of problems have historians faced whilst trying to determine how many of these men were of Chinese heritage? And did you experience some of these problems whilst you were researching for your book?
Well, the first thing I've got to say is that I was very, very fortunate when Albert and I went to Melbourne. We went to the Chinese Museum in Melbourne, and they were just wonderful people. They'd done a lot of work on the Chinese Anzacs. They'd identified, the figure varies between about 240 and 300, but we really don't know for certain. But their work has been crucial in us identifying them as they are, but certainly for me in having the faith to trust their research and to go by what they showed me. But one of the first problems was defining Chinese. How many generations do we need to go back to determine this? And when you look at some of those faces in the book, those Chinese Australian boys don't look Chinese at all, So, when are they Chinese and when are they not? One thing, you're able to quickly identify them is obviously by their Chinese name, like Poon or Singh, but far harder if they had an English surname. And I even got caught up in finding that there were Australians with no Chinese heritage that had Chinese surnames. If you get to Lee and a few names like that, they're both Chinese names and they're non-Chinese names. So it was a bit of a problem. And while we can go through their enlistment papers, they did not describe these men as Chinese or of Asian appearance, much the same as Aboriginals. I mean, they did not put that definition against their name. So it was very hard at times to determine who were Chinese. And as a result, there's probably many more that can be identified in the future.
Will, you mentioned that the Chinese Museum was helpful. How helpful was that to you?
It's interesting because I'd set out to write a book on the Chinese Labour Corps, and here I suddenly find, 200 or 300 Chinese Anzacs, and I'd done a lot of reading on First World War, and I'd never come across Chinese Anzacs, apart from Billy Singh. So I really had to include that in the book, and this created its own problem because I've got one story about men from China going to the First World War. I've got another totally different story about men of Chinese heritage in Australia going to the First World War. So I began to write it, telling one story and then, starting the story again at the back of the book, telling the Chinese Anzac story. But quickly I realised that if I took, the first section, first chapter of the Chinese Labour Corps and put in the first chapter of the Chinese Anzac story and sort of shuffled them and alternated them, it told a concurrent, a more sort of chronological story. But it was hard because I didn't want to have to go back and repeat history. Trying to keep it on that chronological timeline, was at times difficult.
Well, we know of 46 soldiers of Chinese heritage that were killed during the war. Do you think that number could possibly be higher or lower?
Well, I certainly think it could be higher, given, as I said before, that problem of trying to define Chinese and also the numbers who enlisted and who served. The 46 represents known men of Chinese ancestry, so yes, there could be many more.
While some of our listeners might be familiar with the story of Private William Edward Singh, more popularly known as Billy, could you tell us a bit about him for those who may not have heard of him before?
Sure. Billy Singh was a young boy born of an English mother and a Chinese father in Claremont in Queensland in 1886. He was well known in the area as a target and kangaroo shooter, and he enlisted in October 1914, so very early in the war, in the 5th Australian Light Horse Regiment. He was accepted after the recruiting officer disregarded his ancestry. He was quite Chinese looking and he was actually fairly small, but probably because he was known as a champion marksman in the area, in the rifle club. He became famous at Gallipoli as a sniper with 200 confirmed kills and possibly as many as 300. He was very, very modest in his count, and so the confirmed number is 200. He was awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal and later recommended for a military medal. He went on to the Western Front with the 31st Battalion. He was wounded a number of times. He led an anti-sniper unit, interestingly, at the Battle of Polygon Wood in late 1917. While recovering from wounds in Scotland, he married a waitress, but this didn't last. He returned to Australia in, I think, about July 1918 in very poor health. He had wounds and he was affected by gas. His wife came back, but she seemed to disappear into obscurity when they got back to Australia. And he returned to that Proserpine area of Queensland, and life as a miner, a shearer, drover, general labourer. And he died in May 1943, quite alone. It's a sad sort of end to this wonderful man. He died in Brisbane and is buried in Lushwitz Cemetery. And only recently they've provided him a nice memorial and shown some respect for him. So the Chinese Anzac community, but of course there are others.
Absolutely, and so we should talk about others now, Will. And so there was also some other men who received honours for their service, but haven't received quite the same amount of recognition as Billy. Men like Arthur Kwong, the Langtip brothers, and the most decorated Chinese soldier of the AIF, Caleb Shung. What can their stories tell us about the service of our Chinese Anzacs?
Yes, it's interesting. Yes, there are in fact about 19 Chinese Anzacs who are awarded medals for bravery and devotion to duty. The most celebrated, as you said, is Caleb Shang, and he was awarded 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals, so that's a DCM and bar, for actions at Messines in Belgium in June 1917, and again at Dernancourt in 1918, Dernancourt being the same place where those graves were I mentioned earlier. He was also awarded a military medal in May 1918 for his bravery at Villers-Bretonneux. Leslie Langtip was one of 6 brothers who attempted to enlist. The 6 of them turned up at the recruiting table. The recruiting officer said, "Look, we can't kill 6 of you, so you 3 go home and I'll take you 3. In the end, 4 of the brothers enlisted, and Leslie was a real character, and he was actually in the charge at Beersheba, where he was awarded a DCM in Palestine. And there's a great story of him that while in Palestine, he saw this English officer berating his Arab troops. So he went up to him and he said, "Listen, mate, that's not how you should talk to your troops." And this officer sort of would have been a bit put out by this arrogant young Australian private, so he sort of told him where to go, and Leslie Langtip just bopped him in the nose, gave him a smack in the face, knocked him off his feet, and it was actually Lawrence of Arabia. So it's a great story. I love those sort of bits of historic trivia.
They're a part of history, Will, that is forgotten, and it's totally forgotten, and that's a fantastic story that you the famous Lawrence of Arabia and an Australian Chinese soldier punches him and knocks him out. Like, it's just unbelievable. During your research, were you able to interview any descendants of the men who served in either the Labor Corps or the AIF? And if so, what stories were they able to share about their relatives?
Look, I didn't get to speak to anyone with relatives in the Chinese Labor Corps. That's a distant one and a bit hard. But I did get to speak at length with Caleb Shang's great-niece Jo Olsen, and someone you should talk to, in fact. She's done a lot of family history research and work on her grandfather, Sidney Shang, the brother of Caleb, and also on other Chinese Anzacs from North Queensland. These 2 boys found it hard to enlist. They lived in Townsville. They were known as Chinese. They looked Chinese. So they went to Brisbane, where they, were unknown, and there they were able to enlist and get into the AIF. But that's, as I said, a common story.
Well, after the war, the Labor Corps was treated harshly by the British, French and Americans. Can you tell us about this and why it happened? And was it purely because of racism, or was there something more?
Well, the first problem that the Allies had is that they had a couple of million men to return to their countries. I mean, Australia had probably 250,000 plus, another 20,000 wives and dependents. The Americans were there, the Canadians were there were others, South Africans, New Zealanders. They all had to get home. There were very few ships, and the focus at the time, obviously, was getting their own men home. In the case of the Australians, Billy Hughes had directed that he wanted them sent home in good ships, good food, with a band, to make their return home comfortable. So The problem was shipping. But for the Chinese, they were way down the line in the shipping stakes, but there was still a lot to do after the battles in cleaning up, in collecting ordnance, clearing barbed wire, filling in trenches. Really trying to restore those battlefields. But one of the problems were that the British officers of the Labour Corps, they left and returned home because they wanted to get out of the war and get back to England, or principally. So the CLC was left without any commanders, and they had built up a relationship often with their commanding officers. They could communicate with them, but now they were found that they were left with less sensitive people, with language problems, and they were given tasks that were quite dangerous. Cleaning up ordnance on a battlefield is a really seriously dangerous task, and many of them died, sadly. And when you look at those graves, you see that so many died of influenza, they died of disease, starvation, problems like exploding ordnance after the war. Half the graves are post-1918, 1918 through to 1922. The French, as I mentioned earlier, allowed about 8,000 to stay, and they became the basis of the French community. But the British did not. They just wanted to ship them back, get rid of them after they'd done this cleanup. So again, no compensation or medals, no ongoing concern really about their health or welfare. Just you've served your contract, see you later. Of course, the Chinese that went to Russia, we know nothing about them and we don't know what happened to them. So that's a bit of a lost chapter of history there.
Absolutely. Terrible the way they were treated. Absolutely terrible. Well, the story of the Chinese Labour Corps isn't well known in Australia. Is that also the case in China?
It is. And I tried to, when I first embarked on this quest to tell the story, my first attempt was to raise $5,000 and get a plaque and put it up in the Chinese gardens in Sydney to remember the forgotten. I met a number of Chinese, very, very wealthy Chinese, but none of them seemed to connect with the story. None of them took an interest in it, and I certainly didn't get any money until I met Albert, who you'll talk to later. So the Chinese Labour Corps story isn't well known in Australia, or indeed anywhere, and certainly not in China, because, post-World War I, the Chinese fell into this civil war between the communists and the nationalists, Mao Zedong, against Sun against not Zhou Enlai, against Chiang Kai-shek, and finally Mao defeated the nationalist forces, and from 1949, anything pre-1949 Chinese history was forgotten and not important. So the Chinese were not interested, and it's really only been the last year or two that the Chinese government has actually shown any interest in the forgotten men of the First World War. As for Australia, there would have been no knowledge at all of the CLC or their contribution. There was very little interaction between Australian AIF troops and Chinese. They might have been sent to do a job and taken away again. They might have seen them, but they would have had no real connection with them. So there's no knowledge of them, or as I said, I've not heard about them in any of my readings of Australian literature. Hence, my aim then was to get this memorial to the CLC, and it was only really when I spoke and met Albert Wong that this all happened. So that's another story which I'll let him talk about. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, absolutely amazing, and you should be very grateful for the work you've done. So congratulations on that. It's a real case of not giving up and really following through and seeing through that these men are remembered. So well done.
That's right, yeah. And they're not, the CLC are not part of our history, so it's sort of easy for us to ignore them,
What do you hope telling the story of these men and their service will reveal for Australians?
Really, my great hope is that Australians of Chinese heritage will feel part of the Anzac family, feel part of a historical chapter so important to Australians, and so they'll want to attend Anzac Day, they'll want to attend remembrance services, they'll feel that their history and their cultural heritage is interwound with ours. Right now, I doubt you'd see many Chinese faces at a dawn service or at an Anzac Day march. They just don't connect. And this is a great thing. And I'll let Albert talk about this, but the great thing about our collaboration is that he, as a Chinese Australian, now feels part of that heritage. And I think that's really, really important. And it's a wonderful, I hope, contribution to our understanding, our cultural and our multicultural understanding, by embracing Chinese in this country. And they make up about 5% of our population now. So if we can get them comfortable with this, feeling part of this, I think both Albert and I have achieved something.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with that point, Will. I think that's a key point that you touch on, and I think this book, I've read the book, and I think that it's a fantastic read, and I recommend to all the listeners, if you do get the chance, go out and buy Will and Albert's book, because it really shows, as the title, I refer back to the title, it is a forgotten part of history, and I really think it brings to life that history. So, Will, thank you for writing the book. It's a fantastic read, so well done.
Well, as you said, if people are interested, I can provide them a signed copy. Signed copies are always good as presents, directed to someone. You can email me at info@willdavies.net.au. That's info@willdavies, one word, DAVIES.net.au. Cost is $30 for the book plus $15 postage. So very happy to get that out if anyone's interested.
Absolutely, and we'll put a link in the show note to that for you, Wills. Just to sum up, Will, what projects are you currently working on, and where? And obviously, people can get a copy of the book from you. Where else can they get a copy of the Forgotten?
Well, the first part of the question, what am I working on now? I'm about to see published my next book, which is called Secret and Special. It's a history of Z Special operations in the Second World War against the Japanese north of Australia. That's being published on the 3rd of March 2021. Again, if anyone wants a signed copy, they can use that same email address. The cost of that book is $35 plus $15 postage, and I'm happy to sign it to whoever they want and get it out. And after that, I'm looking at a couple of projects now, a couple of biographies, and I'm just doing basic research on those people to see whether, one, there's a story that I can tell, and two, whether my publisher, Penguin Random House, might be interested. So fingers crossed.
Absolutely, and we will definitely get you back on to talk about your upcoming book, The Z Special Forces, another forgotten chapter of the Second World War. Dr. Will Davies, it's been fantastic to get you on and give up your time to tell us a little bit about a forgotten chapter in military history and also in history in general. So, Dr. Will Davies, thank you once again for coming on the show.
Thanks, Adam, very much. All the best.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/truebluehistory, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/truebluehistory, and check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.